So this is like totally cool that you're all here. I think when we put this thing together, we didn't have any idea what, what the result would be. I mean, just in terms of event and audience, because it's not on the regular schedule and it was put together late. So I'm, really, really happy to see you all. I'm very grateful that you came, and this is like a perfect place to hold this event, given Jonathan's long connection with the school. So I'm happy. Thank you. So I want to thank Graham Nixon and Rochelle Rickert and the Studio School for hosting the show and this panel. It's always a bit of a homecoming for me to come back here. And also a special thanks to Marion Smit, she's the head of the Jonathan and Barbara Silver Foundation, and she's the one who's responsible for the beautiful show downstairs and the elegant catalog. And also thank you for asking me to organize this panel. So it's been 26 years since Jonathan's been gone, and in that time there have been a few events, a few shows about his work, but it's pretty minimal. So I feel as a sort of purpose of this event that it's a rare and precious occasion to talk about, and someone we knew and someone whose art that we cared about, and I imagine that a number of you in the audience also knew him and followed his work, so that we have a chance to put some ideas on the table and to develop them and put them out there in such a way that it's not just for us, that it's for people who are coming after us who are really gonna, I think, get a sense of what kind of rich field Jonathan Silver and his work, what a rich field they are. So each of the panelists will have about 5 minutes or more to put some ideas on the table. I really suggested to them that what they most want to say, that they should say. And after that, we'll have a chance to talk among ourselves. And I was sort of hoping, although this is obviously a formal occasion, I was hoping that this would turn into something a little bit more like something between a formal occasion and a dinner conversation in a bar, where we're all talking about someone who really mattered to us. And obviously we will bring you into it, and probably sooner rather than later. We all sort of knew him and have some idea about the issues that drove his work. And but I'm also extremely interested in what it's like to come to his work without knowing what he was obsessed with in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and just responding to the work and these ideas somewhat cold. Okay, my introductions will be brief. Coleen Fitzgibbon is an experimental filmmaker and artist, many of whose films have dealt with the kind of grittiness and the issues of life in this city. And she's long been attached to the Lower East Side and the East Village, which is where Jonathan lived. She started working on a film on Jonathan, I guess it was 1991 or after we found out that he was ill, and Coleen started to interview him and started to interview a great many people. And that film, that remarkable film, a 41-minute film, Jonathan Silver, Infidel in the Studio, was shown in 2016, and there's going to be a show of it at the Anthology Film Archives at 7:30 on January 10th. Tom Otterness' sculpture has been part of the artistic landscape of the city for, I feel like, 3 decades or more. He's responsible for some of the most popular public artworks in the city. The Real World was installed in Battery Park City in 1992. Life Underground was installed in the 14th Street, 8th Avenue subway station in 2001. He's represented by the Marlborough Gallery. Phong is an artist, writer, curator, publisher, and as you all know him, I'm sure, as the artistic director of the Brooklyn Rail, one of the treasures of the city. He attended the studio school from 1985 to 1987. And as many as you know, he's a kind of whirlwind of diverse and influential creative activity, and it's impossible for any of us to completely keep up with him. But his 2019 projects include a Jonas Mekas retrospective. Bruce Gagnier is a painter and sculptor, now primarily a sculptor, who's taught at the studio school since 1979. From 1979 to 1984, he was its dean. He shows with the John Davis Gallery in Hudson and Thomas Park Gallery in Seoul, South Korea. All of us on the panel knew Jonathan. Bruce knew him the longest. They were both in Peter Agostini's class in Columbia in the 1960s, and then they were at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro together a few years after that, where they drew together from the model pretty much 7 days a week, right? Okay, so wanting to take some 5 minutes myself to put some introductory thoughts on the table, I had a number of ideas that came to my mind. Thought maybe John to talk a bit about Jonathan and Cubism, or Jonathan and music, or Jonathan and art history, because he was, when I met him, he was as much an art historian as he was an artist, and his relationship to art history was quite distinct. Or about the importance of Meyer Shapiro, his teacher at Columbia, who seems to me without question the most important intellectual figure in Jonathan's life. What I will do instead is to read and then offer 4 very brief preliminary responses to his words that begin my interviews with him in 1992. When I turned on the tape recorder, we were talking about drawing and sculpture, and this is what he said. He said, I was thinking not just about the relationship between drawing and sculpture. Something comes through in my sculpture that is beyond the range of my intellect, which is some kind of hope or belief in the continuity of substances, and that expresses itself directly in my handling of materials. So that even if there's a pathos that's overwhelming, and even if there's destruction, even if there are all those things which have negative connotations, there's some kind of vitality that transmits itself that is not necessarily part of my intellect, which is more skeptical in character. It's something else. My ability to sculpt has some other source than anything I can actually locate in myself or in my mental life. And I just want to go back to that sentence. Something comes through in my sculpture that's beyond the range of my intellect, which is some kind of hope or belief in the continuity of substances, and that expresses itself directly in my handling of materials. The continuity of substances, those are sort of haunting words that really, for me, push at the edges of language. They seem to me to suggest the particular materialism and belief in inspirited matter, and with it a particularly sculptural speech, one that may distinguish artists who are sculptors at their core from artists who, for one reason or another, make sculpture. Jonathan's materiality had a particular consistency, by which I mean that the consistency of the space he activates on a page is akin to the consistency of a plaster head. This consistency lends itself to words like density, thickness, and volume, although I'm not sure how helpful any of these words are in the end. Volume may come the closest. It's a sculptural word, one Jonathan used often when talking about his drawings as well as about his sculpture. He spent a good deal of time looking at certain Egyptian heads. He was overwhelmed by the space generated by the figures in Michelangelo's Medici Chapel, which for him conveyed in the most experiential terms the drama of thought, feeling, and history rolled into one. The material consistency in Jonathan's work leads me less to Giacometti, who was obviously a formative presence in his life, than to artists like Gustin and Rothko, about whom I almost never heard him speak. In other words, and for the moment I have no idea how to address this, I'm quite sure that the identity of his continuity of substances is deeply informed by his enormous effort to think through his relationship with Jewish continuity and wreckage and the Jewish religion. And finally, Jonathan was very interested in certain kinds of rhetorical eloquence. Beethoven, Shakespeare, Milton, Thomas Mann, Their kinds of poetic flow were for him sculptural things, sculptural stuff. He knew that their eloquence depended upon the ideas and themes that inspired them, and studied these themes and ideas, but for him such rhetorical expression was also its own form of content, one that had the ability to carry the substance and drama of energy and hope. He was interested in this rhetorical flow without grandiosity. The work downstairs is humble. Coleen?
Okay. Thanks, Michael. And actually, I started doing the film because of Michael. When Michael found out that Jonathan was ill, I think I came in to film the last 4 to 5 months while he was alive. So I actually know him less than most of you who are here. There's a lot of people here who knew him very well, including Bruce and Michael. But in those 4 or 5 months together, with Michael mostly doing the interviews originally, and then I interviewed people later, it was very compelling. They talked about how he started as an art historian and then went to, Jonathan started working on heads with Christopher Carnes. They both sort of did it at the same time, and then Jonathan sort of grew into doing, as he said, his heads started growing feet and got longer and elongating, and then he started making these huge figures, and then from there, installations. And I think I actually did not get to see Jonathan work while he was alive. He had already stopped working for, I'm not sure how long, because he'd done the last installation, which was the Gretchen piece, I think. But the photographs that he had of the installations were pretty incredible, like the lower room. And I thought, for me, that those were some of the most interesting pieces, because he started with maybe just the heads, and then he started moving the heads, taking similar heads and putting them in the figures in several different places, and sort of making these monumental Egyptian-like figures in a huge installation, like in the lower room. And in that, at the Sculpture Center, you actually, Tom saw the thing, and he described it to me, where Jonathan had made these huge armatures and just put clay on them, and they gradually, over the course of the months of the show, cracked and fell off. And that was fairly new, for sculpture installations. When I was walking through the labyrinth here, I thought of, Jonathan coming here to teach, as he did also in Montclair. And one of the first slides that I saw was it's called Calvary. And I believe it was set here in the New York Studio School. And a very strange kind of installation with elongated figures and a sort of pile of mud, I think, or clay. Well, I don't know what else to say other than it was great, talking with him. And I sort of regretted not being able to get, film him as he was actually working. So it's your turn.
Okay. I just want to say what a beautiful show it is downstairs. I'm sure you guys all went. I've never looked at the work quite the same way. I'm not sure even is the work that's all distorted, is that the late work or the early work? It seems divided in two parts.
The dogs or the late
Yeah.
The dogs are later.
The dogs are later, okay. But you see this sort of, you look closely at the drawings and you see this kind of architecture, this hollow architecture, what I saw in it. And then the distortions, just like off the reservation, he just went off. And in the sculptures, I felt the same feeling of this, these volumes kind of broken and turned inside out. I was going to say, I didn't realize, I've recently gone back to the Art Students League, and I never studied sculpture, but I studied painting there, and I went back. Now I'm going to sculpture classes, realistic sculpture classes. And I'm thinking, oh, this is because of Jonathan being around this work, and it's fascinating to be in this studio. I assume everybody here, I just make the assumption that we're all artists, right? So we know this stuff, or we've been in it. But it is very material, and clay and plaster and saws and tools, and it's about the physicality of putting things together. And you have a model, a naked model, a clothed model, a head, a something. So there's a person, and I imagine Jonathan in his studio with a model and these tools and this material and this kind of very simple life inside the studio. I may talk myself into a corner. I was really impressed with it. And like I first knew the work from your writing about him in the lower room, right? What year was that?
89.
89. And this is an emotional memory that I don't know if it really, I've seen photos that don't seem to match my memory of it, but my memory is that it was in this lower room and it seemed like all the walls and the floor were covered with wet clay. And I'd gotten there after seeing the review maybe 3 days later, and it had started to crack. But it was very theatrical, very curtains and figures would seem to be characters in a Greek play or something. And it was an atmosphere I'd never seen in artwork before. And the concept under it of bringing the studio out into the show, the making of it was the show, and it seemed really exciting to me. And then the idea that the clay was just left, and by the end of the show, you knew it would all be on the floor, right? A sort of drama of its own.
Maybe I can mention
Yeah.
that was at the Sculpture Center.
Yeah.
In 89, and the old Sculpture Center, which was on 69th Street. Mm-hmm. And Marion Griffith, who ran the Sculpture Center there, she'd gotten in maybe a year before, I'm not sure, but she developed a program by which an artist would be in there all summer. Huh. And the first installation in the fall would be to take over the gallery. And so that's what it was like. And the Grunenbaum Gallery gave Jonathan a chance to do an installation, I think in 86.
86, yeah.
Yeah, and then in the Sculpture Center, that was the first time. So he could go over there. He could go there and he could live in the gallery for 4 to 6 weeks, and do it, and it would be up. And at that time, that was a fairly novel idea.
Yeah, yeah. And then there was a big gap, in my memory anyway. I didn't see Jonathan or meet him really until Coleen started shooting. So then I saw him in this studio, and it seemed like Coleen said, he had finished sculpting, it seemed, but it was, instead of a clay room, it was a white plaster room. And he obviously was taking this process of making waste molds, clay, and then you make a negative and you cast plaster and you break that off, and you have these processes. It seems so integral to just a normal active sculptor's studio, and his exploring kind of the inside of the mold or the inside of the head, and then breaking it and turning it so that that's exposed to the outside. All these things seem to have meaning. That's the best I can do right now. So,
Yes, I like what Tom just said, that a very simple life of an artist, but not a simple of a very complex person.
yeah.
I had a chance to watch Coleen's film this afternoon before coming here, and it was wonderful how it frames pretty much many things had been said, wonderful insight about the work, but I think the two things that really stuck in my mind right now is the beginning and the end, made by Jonathan himself, beginning where he made remarks about when you're growing up, becoming an artist in the 60s or 70s, there were no sympathy or any kind of encouragement for Baroque or Hellenistic art. And then in the end, he make remarks toward his awareness of being dying, his mortality, by quoting Hamlet, I think. After Hamlet had witnessed the ghost of his father, if it will be now, this not come. If it be now not, yet it will come. And I think there's something about that was very easy to identify, his awareness of fatality. That I think everything contrary to determinism, being aware of what is being depend on causality in a way. He was the opposite of it. I think he made a lot of allusion in the film to the theme of fate. Even those who try to escape it, I think he gave example of Oedipus, certainly Eurydice and Orpheus. So that was wonderful to put him in that context of why he became so aware of his own mortality. I think that's very profound to look at the work and see that. As far as Cubism concerned, which I think it was very interesting, you know him longest, Bruce. But when I was a student here, in the fall 85, I was barely 20 or 19 years old, and one of my jobs was to help to organize the lecture like this, which I rarely miss, because Jonathan was the first to say to me, if you don't want to go to Columbia for graduate school in art history, you may as well attend to all those lectures here. And I remember him saying that. It's as if he was giving me the order. Primarily, at those years, I was a painter working with mostly Nick Corone and charcoal jewelry. But Jonathan and I became friends because we shared this deep admiration for Marion Shapiro, to whom he have studied work with. And I don't think he ever finished his PhD in Giacometti painting. That was his dissertation. But we have a lot of time talking about that mutual admiration, but also the love for baseball, which is something that some of you know about Jonathan. I think Amanda knew Jonathan, y'all know Jonathan well, besides Marion Smit, of course. But to talk about baseball was a most momentous and exciting of all. Because, you work your ass off here at the studio, and you want to go there and you want to watch the film, or watch old film he used to have. And also the Mets series, you have to remember that. 1986, I believe in October, the Mets won the World Series. And it was amazing. I never seen anybody more excited than Jonathan Silver. That's a contrary to what you would thought of him as an artist and a very serious human being. He was a child, and talking about baseball was wonderful. I remember he gave me the book by James T. Farrell, very famous little book about baseball. It's called My Baseball Diary, about the author recalling the 1917 White Sox World Series in Chicago, because that's where he grew up, just like Sobello, that whole crowd, Chicago. And I remember he explained to me about why baseball was called American pastime. Because, he was aware of the fact I came from Vietnam, and I always think of America like a big empire, like Roman Empire, And I remember we talk about how the Roman invented Colosseum, the gladiators, how they brought all the slaves and trained them to fight with also very strong, exotic, scary animals. It's the way to show violence to the Roman citizen, only to amplify their safety. And a similar baseball have I think, a role in which everything else is so fast, so rapid. All the sport, whether basketball or hockey or football, baseball calms you down. You go there with your friend, and it's really drinks, you eat hot dog, and it's very little thing going on, you know. And I remember how excited learning more about baseball. That was the best memory about spending time with Jonathan. So I don't know. I see humor, however ironic and self-deprecating it might be. There's a deep sense of humor in the work. I mean, you see that early work that you identify as maybe analytical cubist phase, but the later works, he went off the track, went off the rail, so to speak. All this curvy, linear, very sensuous human, the way that the human body was being drawn is not at all like the early work. It's the contrary. So there's this whole contradiction that he was aware from the get-go. Because if you remember, I don't remember the exact date, you were the dean at the time, Bruce, no? Yes. For a while. You and Jonathan didn't get along those years, I remember that. For like a year or two. But I remember there was a lecture by Nicholas Callas here. Yeah. And it was a very special incident because Nicholas Callas was the great Greek poet, surrealist poet, and he did a show with terrific Friedrich Kiesler in 1947. It's called Blood Flames at Ugo Gallery. Does that ring a bell, Michael? Kind of. Okay, that's very interesting because Jonathan, I don't think he showed the show, but he knew about Nicholas Callas, who died a few years later. He knew about Kiesler. He knew about, which you show in your film, Duchamp, 6 miles, 1,000-mile string installation at the First Papers Surrealist exhibition, and that was 1942. That happened in the same month as Kiesler opening of the art of century. So surrealism inherently played a very quiet part of Jonathan that he didn't want to reveal. This kind of excessive emotionality, this kind of desire to, I would say, intervene or destroy even cubist, white cube space. I think there's something there that you see. I only pick it up now with the first room and the second room, and mention the sculpture center show, Michael. It was the immersive installation, which he always wanted to do, but he couldn't do it until neo-expressionism came about. I think neo-expressionism was the way to contextualize Jonathan, even though he's really from the outside looking in, but he was in it too. I remember we were talking about Leon Golub and Leon Golub's admiration for Hellenistic sculpture and how he was able to extrapolate and began to integrate into his late work. So it's very interesting. He was both an outsider and yet he's an insider. He's a poet, but yet he used magic. He's a magician and a poet from an external way, and internally he still maintained his poetic vision of the work.
True.
Make sure you speak use the mic.
Yes, I'm going to have to use the mic because I don't speak very loud. I'm going to read this. By 1964, when I met Jonathan in Peter Agostini's class, he had found a plastic solution for perception. There was a small dot at the end of each line, which impressed me very much, which made concrete the simple lesson of Agostini on how to draw the figure. Peter said, look from this point to that point, from here to there. And he demonstrated with a pencil a simple way of spatializing the act of drawing as an empirical cubism. He was casting rays through space, making relations. That small dot placed on the end of the measured spatial line that Jonathan made was a reproduction of the lesson. I should say, I was convinced right at the beginning that this person could find a plastic solution to almost any idea. He could draw or sculpt any idea or phenomenon into a rigorous plastic formal concept. There was, however, sometimes, I have to say, an extreme comical perspective in his drawings. We used to comment a lot about this in our sessions in Greensboro. He worked slowly and almost methodically. It always seemed the way to do it was forming itself in his head a few measures or beats ahead of the action. He was terribly intelligent, probably the most intelligent person I ever had intimate contact with, which only meant that you had to be very careful all the time not to say anything careless. In North Carolina at the University in Greensboro around 1968, Peter Agostini, Jonathan, Lance Solaroli, who was a sculptor, and a painter named Andy Martin and myself drew together 7 nights a week for 3 hours for 3 years. I guess we didn't have much else to do. Jonathan was there 1 semester each year and Peter every other week. We gave out opinions during the breaks. We'd walk around and look at one another's drawings all the time. And the opinions would go such as, you got it there, but you missed it over here. You don't really know how to make an arm, do you? And the head does not sit in space or lie on the shoulders. It gives you some idea of what our concerns were. We were quite empirical, really. Jonathan's comments were delivered in exquisite verbal formulations, which I know Michael can attest to, and you can see for yourself in the film, accompanied by a wry smile that implied, I think, that he was enjoying himself. We were far away then from the art world and its stylistic influence, immersed in the figure and plasticity. We constituted a small, intense world among ourselves, particularly Lance, Jonathan, and I, but Peter was part of it. But of course, Peter was much older and world famous at that point. Some evenings after the 3-hour sessions, we'd go to the slide theater. Jonathan had the key, and 1 week at a time, we would in turn put together what we called slide packs. We would just pick things out at random and give mini lectures to the others. When later he began his prolonged studies of the human head, I should say that Jonathan had to spend some time during those mini lectures straightening out the dates and the attributions. When later he began his prolonged studies of the human head, there was nothing forced. The work was mindful and early on gentle. The intelligence of his early forms of sculpture exploded in the midst of the robust exuberance of the 80s. One might have seen this coming. Early on, he often expressed doubt that a simple sculpture could represent a complete worldview. This frame of mind was in step with the present and future developments in art, which is what Phong and Tom already suggested, that at a certain point he did find himself in the midst of the contemporary art world. His wife Barbara was a very good French cook as well as a restorer of good pianos. Phong might remember the following. One of them was brought into the library when Jonathan began lecturing. I should mention he was a Juilliard student as well, I think in composition. And the thing was, he could perform the music of any period. as he lectured on that period. So if he was in whatever period he was lecturing on, he could accompany his lecture with the music of that period. Barbara's cooking in the evening guaranteed Jonathan one good meal per day, because otherwise I think Jonathan was always defeating the possibility of his own survival with egg creams, Twinkies, cool cigarettes, and Coke, which pretty much during the day took care of his diet. As far as exercise was concerned, it was pretty much confined to hailing a cab. Except he did get the first baseman's mitt later on in life and always wanted to go out in the alley and have a catch. I don't know how he ever learned to catch. He'd never seen a baseball diamond up close. I think the closest he ever got was at the Mets games. I also think he was in analysis most of his life, which perhaps gives us a clue as to why he associated frontality, which became an important part of his work, with the Rorschach test. At a certain point, castings of the early heads were cut and altered with the vectors of cubism, and sometimes based on a theory of reversal. The heads, if you look closely, are cut right in the center. A mold is taken from one side and reversed to the other side. It was an important and decisive move that opened many, many possibilities. He and Chris Cairns, with whom he had established a very close collaborative and argumentative collegiality, beginning as early as the first head study, started putting this device of splitting the head into two halves, which was meant to provoke a connection to the unconscious of the viewer. Jonathan came at this device from other sources as well, but from also his experience and deep interest in Freudian psychology, as well as his close scrutiny of Giacometti. Chris, interestingly enough, as I remember, was approaching the invention through his interest in a very beautiful and interesting certain head by Fritz Rotruba that was in the Philadelphia Museum called Split Head. Jonathan wrote a rather brilliant essay on the subject of frontality in the Rorschach in Art News. He once told me the only person who responded to that essay was a psychiatrist. They each went on to make the same reversals with the human figure, often using an earlier head as an identifying feature. These analytics and disruptive scaffoldings, which are so interesting, the cubist vectors as well as the reversals, provoke an appearance, for me, of content in various ways, as spatial intelligence, knowledge gained, or as cruel and dehumanizing affronts to the other. The canceling out of the simplicity of outer appearances, coupled with the device of the reversal, opens a door to the suggestion of ideas and implications from deep sources, which I think is part of their power and the dialectic that's going on that we feel when we're in front of them. Some of the faceting, which also always portrays knowledge and intelligence to the rigors of the task and seriousness in the drawings, merges when used as simple structure across the surface with the illustrations in the instructional manuals of the Russian and German academies. This structuring involves the dominance of a tactile mind, which is what I think dominated Jonathan's mind, although he loved to work from perception. In fact, he looked down on the rest of us early on if we did not work from perception. The structuring involves the dominance of a tactile mind over the visual, which by some on the side of the conceptual can be seen as a higher and necessary state of mind to assume as a plastic artist. At the point that he was immersed in the split heads, in my opinion, he was in command of a language ability rare in his generation. He was in a place, I think, both within the work and just in his preparation to do work of the highest order. I believe that. It is interesting that the splitting of the head often replicated the strategy and convention of splitting the cube in painting, something that is almost universally found in Annunciation paintings and vividly in the Bronzino portrait of a young man at the Met, where the mechanism of the device is illustrated by the young man's fingers opening the book and in the fingers of his hand on the hip. Looking at these reversal heads today, this initiatory and extraordinary idea of reversal seems to have immersed itself in the overall formation in the process of making these heads, which I think Tom was talking about. They just seem made by somebody. And to me, these very intelligent ideas seem to have disappeared into those heads somehow. They've just become a mystery. He was, despite the imposition of a concept, a simple and empirical worker. He was just like any other sculptor, except he had no training, which made him even more interesting in a way. He never was in a studio as a sculptor, learning from a teacher. I am no longer aware of the apparatus quality that once was so apparent in those heads. Jonathan was not trained as a studio artist. He kept his methods simple and straightforward, which made even the later individual pieces that act out the theatrical work seem like honest stagecraft. I would like someday to see a show of the individual pieces from those great installations just installed like African art outside of the context of the ceremony. I think that would be quite interesting. In the 70s, and in more than one piece of sculpture, he was putting pieces together with airplane glue. I don't know if he smelled it. I could smell it. But most remarkably, he collaged in one piece, and it was remarkable. He was collaging bits of colored found things onto a rather remarkable piece of sculpture, which has been shown a few times, with gum, using the Wrigley's he was chewing between cigarettes. If he wasn't smoking, he was chewing gum. As his feeling for collage as a method expanded, he used a surgeon's flexible wire bone saw to cut the plaster. I found that a bit morbid, but that's what he did. The simplicity was a saving grace of the individual pieces, even as the gaseous narrative installations verged on sadism and necrophilia. In the narrative theater and many of the late large works, the form and content, I know that last bit sounds a bit rough, but I wanted to say that because I think that many things come out of the work, and some of them are rather challenging. In the narrative theater, many of the later large works, the form and content part ways, and we are left with a almost psychic hysteria that dazzles as it confuses. However, the sculptural residue of these late works as individual pieces of figurative art, although morphing through collage into body parts suggesting intentional dismemberment, are resilient and compelling as survivors. It was apparent that he emerged as a thoroughly contemporary artist in the very problematic and transitory period of the 80s, as an artist who was as compelling as any of those who gained recognition in that period.
Thank you, all of you. So maybe, I'm interested in questions you might have. I guess first of all, that like this relationship to contemporary art that you raise, and Phong and Bruce, the way you raise it, and I want to push on that a little bit because it's something that I don't totally understand in him. And even if you mention an artist like Golub, where I can see a certain kind of connection with Hellenistic art, the fact that there was someone else who was working with these Greek, in this Greek tradition. But there was, I don't know what Jonathan actually looked at that way. His work is so different from Golub. Just like it's so different from Kiefer and the neo-expressionists. So in a sense, the question of how what was going on around him actually got into his head is an interesting one, and maybe what I want to attach to that a little bit is to make the point that this which you mentioned, Bruce, which is the idea of his formal education, because Jonathan dropped out of school when he was 13, and basically didn't go back to school until he entered the School of General Studies at Columbia when he was 21 or 22. So in some ways he's self-taught. And, he took certain lessons, he studied music, but it was very much on his own. And I think that there was there's a way in which he was kind of aware of what was going on around him, where he thought about ideas very deeply, but it was never academically informed. Mm-hmm. So that there's a certain kind of character or personality that the work has, which can make it seem, almost from the beginning, to be something on its own, and it makes it difficult, for me anyway, to actually to figure out what this relationship to the contemporary was, because he had it. I mean, just by being someone who was really sensitive to the world around him. He read newspapers, he listened to talk radio all night. Mm-hmm. That was what he kind of worked. That was the background music for him. But like how I don't think of him in relation to any of the contemporary trends, but nevertheless, somehow he was affected by it. And I agree with you. I think it was liberating what happened with the Neo-Expressionism in 1982. The whole field broke open with that. But I just wondered whether you have any particular thoughts yourself on how he processed information, like how he like what he saw, how he processed information, and how that actually affected what he did.
Well, no more, less self-taught than someone who also have a relationship to abstract expressionism, namely Forrest Bass. Also self-taught, one of beloved figure that Maya Shapiro also supported. But what I think so interesting here is the relationship to Freud. Maya Shapiro was, when you name Maya Shapiro, you talk about Maya Shapiro, you have to talk about Freud. You have to talk about those apples, those oranges in the still light that have evoked erotic imagery, which is something that in the film he talked about how he saw images, figure images in the parlor paintings, autumn rhythm even. So I think that's something you can't really deny about Jonathan. Commitment to the figure, and yet he very much wanted to free by it in some way. Now just look at the first room, those wonderful tiny drawing in the grid, off center. You notice it's never in the center of the page, it's always off the center, and within that little rectangles, you see the central axis. And the geometry that he invented there, you can refer to it, I don't know, cubism, whatever, but you realize that it's really the line that skate around it. That's where the emotion lies. It's not so much the formation of the straight line, the rectilinear that formulate the geometry. It's those lines that really go and skate on top of it, that he wants to liberate from. I think that in some way you can even see why he loved baseball, Michael, because baseball have that geometry. Everyone have his spot. I remember we talked about how terrific Keith Hernandez was at the first baseman, because he know how to cap he have a quick lightning, but he also have a strong throwing hand, so he can throw it to the third baseman, to weight box and go back to Gary Carter with the catcher. But those activities are the ones just similar to the way those curvy, liberating lines that appear on top of that geometry. So there's a way that we can talk about that. But I want to ask you, it's my turn to ask you, because you know longest. The relationship of Maya Shapiro is interesting. He never finished his dissertation. What was in it? Did he ever share with you what was the narrative, the content?
Well, there is something. I mean, he was working on a dissertation on Giacometti's painting, which still, he published an article on it in Art News, and it still has this kind of wild originality to it, the way he was looking at it. I think he just decided at a certain point that he was an artist. And whereas he had this split career for a while, or split life between art historian and sculptor, and I think that there's a certain point in the 70s where he probably knew he wasn't going to go in the academic world as an art historian, and that he was a sculptor, and then he threw everything into sculpture. But what he did, and I feel like it's interesting to talk there about like his relationship to Cubism, because artists study other moments, historical moments, but I've never known an artist who immersed himself in a historical moment the way he immersed himself in Cubism. It's a form of research, and I don't think we think about artistic research that way. But so he read books, he looked at paintings, and he drew. He never tired of drawing from Cubist paintings, and he really, really understood how it's analytic Cubism. He really understood how it worked. So I guess just to answer to your question there, I mean, one, I think that he just decided that sculpture was going to be it, but it continued, the work continued to be informed by this certain relation to art history, and Shapiro was important because this reading of form, where form was so much could kind of go anywhere, could carry the world, could carry the self, could carry everything. Which Shapiro could bring to his formal analysis of works. I think Jonathan picked that up, and was very actually introspective and analytical about the way he used form himself, which I think was Bruce. Like, he knew the psychological implications of whatever it was he was doing. So
well, Cubism only existed roughly between 1907, even 09 really, to the outbreak of the First War, so 1914. I know that when Picasso walked Prague to be going to the front to the train, that was the end of analytical Cubism. But what is so, I'm asking you in a way, because you have that close 7-day week working with Christopher Cairns and Peter Agostini. What was being discussed? I mean, besides the perpetual self-criticism or criticize the other, was how was the language of analytical Cubists was being deployed or shared?
Let me just add something to that too, because I feel for Jonathan and for my generation too, Cubism was changed the world. I mean, the introduction of seeing those paintings in the 60s. And sort of seeing how they worked, how they functioned spatially, and what opened up. Everything was different after that. I mean, because we live in a very different time now, and I still teach, and I'm around students, and I don't know how important all that is. But for Jonathan's generation and mine, and I think Bruce's, it was an earthquake. It really changed everything. So I don't know whether Bruce, like the question about what you were talking about and what you actually said in relation to Cubism. But I would also add to that the question of what it was like to encounter it at that time and to be really hit by it.
Well, I think it's true that for the group of us, Jonathan and Lance and Peter, for instance, Peter Agostini did not like modern art. He was a great modern artist, but he did not like modern art. He liked Donatello. But
that's later.
That was always for me.
Really?
He really didn't like it. But it's okay. But he was a good modern artist. But early on, when we all began drawing, whether it was with Nick or with Peter, with Peter, it wasn't about Cubism, but there was no rendering with shadow. There was no shading. There was no atmosphere entered in. Everything had to be analyzed with line alone, and that was a criteria amongst us when we were drawing together always. We really were critical of shading. We were critical as were many people of our time, of illusion of that kind. So that our approach to drawing the figure was, in a sense, conceptual and naturally was cubistic. And the source for it, of course, was the early drawings of Giacometti that he probably did in Bordel's class. But anybody who strayed away in the group when we were drawing or would be criticized for anything that was outside of those limitations.
But could you, I wonder, when you talk about illusion there and a kind of resistance to illusion, Cubism is a world of illusion,
We
right?
know
So,
that,
so
yeah.
how do you,
Yeah.
I mean, the whole kind of miracle of those paintings is the way they actually open up spatially. So when you
Yep.
talk about the resistance there, what do you mean?
No, that was the power of Cubism, is that it conveyed an autonomous deep space, unlike how it is usually described for us. It seemed to be the most spatial, the most autonomously spatial of all the forms of art. And we were very interested in distance, and it's particularly in conveying the sense of volume within those limits and with those devices.
I don't know as much about Jonathan as you do, and I agree that those early works were very, interested in Cubism, but it seemed like he also was abstract expressionism. In a way, he studied Cubism, but he really reacted against abstract expressionism, which was his time, really, or his age group. And then he went into, when he started doing the heads, they were more cubistic, but as he went along, he sort of took Giacometti's painting in terms of emotion and really instilled emotion into those installations, like the one that I didn't mention, which was the Queen's Museum. And when I went to the Queen's Museum to find it, Jonathan really didn't say much about it. And when I went there was just one slide of this piece that he was commissioned to do by the Queen's Museum, which was called Man Thrown into a Subway Car, man thrown into subway tracks. And it was this sort of amazing, sort of surrealistic, like you were saying, much more sort of macabre, dark, black humor about, a very New York experience. And it was these huge ceilings with curtains and then all these plaster figures. It was really amazing. And there was just this one slide, and he hardly talked about it, but it was towards the end. I think it was 89 at the Queen's Museum, something like that. But an amazing piece that nobody really sees or remembers anymore, which was much more surrealistic.
Yeah, it's strange. They're not very well documented at all.
No,
I mean,
it's a
he didn't
shame.
even think that much about that.
It's pretty moving.
I
It's
think
really
that,
sad.
and I want to sort of open it up to the audience, but I think that this relation to abstract expressionism is important because I think it's formative, actually, in the work. And I think without Pollock, and certainly without de Kooning, and without that sort of notion of that particular notion of environmental space and development.
Happenings.
Yeah, but there was also that sort of mythical element in abstract expressionism which Jonathan attached to. It's very different. I think it's very different from happenings. But and I think he was for a long time, and you see it in those heads. There's a kind of this prohibition against narrative. It comes out of a certain ethos of abstraction. What abstraction in relation to figuration. He was a figurative artist, but a figurative artist with a strong sense of what you could not do. And I think what he did not do and what he finally did in 1982 when his work changed and it became more Baroque and Hellenistic and theatrical, and he gave himself permission to do that. But I think that I think that abstract expressionism was in the background when he was starting out, and I have a feeling it was always there.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
To you, to Tom? You know, basically, we tend to forget that Giacometti did not come to work from life after having done all these amazing surrealist sculptures for a long time. All of that intensity of the emotion, restrained emotion, was the outcome of those wonderful dismemberment of form, as particularly to the tail end, 32, 33 or so. You see that in Woman with Her Throat Cut. Yeah. I mean, that's the piece that really been thrown out. He expelled from the group by 35. So it's interesting, without those emotions, the surrealist Freudian intensity and dream and all that anxiety wouldn't have been occur later as a outcome on the more restrained work from life. So it's not a technique. I think that's something that I always value. Bonnet Newman first saw, I think, Giacometti in 48. And he described it, those figures look like spit, literally like spit building up the form. And I think in a way, that's an interesting relationship, witnessing this verticality, this right central axis vertical line that you see all the drawing in the sculpture. He was aware of Newman as much as Giacometti, Michael. And if there's something, if we can say there's similarity that Newman might have in common, pictorial rapport with Giacometti, it would be the strip of description. You talk about shade and form. There's none of that in Newman. It's just a bare architectural space that it's really intensify your awareness of the space that you're in. Just as much of strip away from this naturalistic skin and whatever else shape and form that entailed the human form in Giacometti. So it demands that kind of interval negative space around you. That's the thing that I think he was thinking about that. But that's just my perception. I think it's unresolved, but it's definitely there.
Michael, I would like to add an anecdote to your what you brought up about his relation to the 80s. One day in the 80s, Jonathan called me up. We lived fairly close to one another, and he asked me to meet him on West Broadway. And when I met him, he was smoking even more than usual and in a high state of anxiety and excitement. And went to the gallery, which he wanted us to go into, and he stood back while I went into the gallery. And I knew he wanted to see my expression when I turned around. And it was the Anselm Kiefer Big Earth show. And we argued all the way down the street after seeing that show together, but it obviously had a big effect on him.
Well, I think that that kind of permission, or maybe even the necessity to bring history into the work and to bring it in some kind of grand way, that the time really demanded it, and that you had to do that. I think that was unquestionably important. So now I think we should open it up to you. Yes. Wait for the mic.
I'll try and wrap this up as succinctly as I can. One of the great gifts was to see Jonathan give crits. And when he gave crits, there was an incredible ability to look at students or people's work in their own terms. None of the modernist purity that he had in his own work at a certain point had anything to do with his capacity to look at other people's work. So there was also, when you saw him do it, there was an element of eclectic and understanding, a very rich and broad and eclectic understanding of the world, which connects to his capacity of collage. I think that the two artists, and this may be sacrilege, let alone to say it here in this hallowed room, drawing room of the studio school. The two artists that he was actually very influenced from weren't from the 80s at all, they were from the 60s. One of them was George Siegel, who he was acquainted with also through Meyer Shapiro. And the other one was Kienholz, or Kienholz, I never know how to say it. And I think that the influence of these two artists on a myriad spectrum of ways also had to do with bringing narrative into his installations. As much as he was involved with the material, his installations, and they were classical narratives. The symbolism and the tableau was narrative. You had a boat taking you to hell, and that's as narrative as it gets. And I think that if Bruce's idea of taking the sculptures from those installations out of the context of the installation, it's kind of like separating the Kienholz and the George Siegel aspects. Not that he was influenced in a didactic way, but I'm just saying I think that he was around in the 60s, he was around in the 70s, and I think that that's what I think.
Thank you.
Thanks. I have a question for Coleen. I'm curious about, I'm just thinking about, Michael, your reference to the word substance, and I'm thinking about your film and the making of your film. I don't know, was it video or film?
No, it was video.
Okay, so I guess I'm sort of thinking about that in a way as your substance, and like how did Jonathan's work inform your decisions around editing, what you chose to capture, how you chose to capture it, what you cut out, thinking about, I guess, his own relationship with substance and materiality and how it informed your shaping of the documentary?
Well, you know, when I first filmed, it was really Bert Carpenter and Jonathan, and mostly Michael and Jonathan talking. And there was a lot of material, and I was thinking about it tonight, thinking, oh, I should just put that together, because, you know, it was really great. And basically, Michael took Jonathan through, starting with the heads, then the torsos, then the full figures, and then the installations when they were doing this. I think we did 4 or 5 different days. It's hard to tell. And Jonathan was tired all the time, so we couldn't get that too much, because you know, he worked pretty hard at it, but he was very sick. And I couldn't, you know, I was very sad not to get him actually working. In the film, there's one scene where he just picks up the cloth, the damp cloth that's covering the sculpture, and that's as much as we got close to actually working for him. And there were so many great people, that other artists that knew Jonathan, that, you know, I didn't get a lot of people I wanted to get in the film. I didn't know there were a lot of people that should have been in the film, because I really didn't know Jonathan. I only knew Michael. And so a lot was out. So I had to, and, you know, in making the film, the original, I tried to keep it so that even though Jonathan was dying throughout the film, I tried to keep it in terms of heads, torsos, figures, and go by the work. So sometimes he has hair, sometimes he doesn't have hair, you know, it moves around. And, you know, I would have liked to have him actually, you know, with the clay, or, you know, moving the sculpture around or talking about it a little more. Most of the time, you know, I don't know, it's, you know, you could make any film that goes on much longer. I would have liked to have Bruce in it, and Chris Carnes, and people who actually worked with him, Agostini, you know, who was, I think, dead by that point, and a bunch of students of his that were amazing to talk with. But I only had limited resources, basically, and I thought I needed to wrap it up before Barbara died. So,
Phong, I just wonder if there was like a particular kind of intuition that you had listening to this that you wanted, that was behind your question.
I think it was thinking about, I forgot who mentioned it, about the surgical tool.
oh yeah,
The methods that Jonathan used to cut or take away, and sort of thinking about
Rick,
the shaping of the film in the deeper consideration of his life and work, and sort of what that reflection process sort of birthed in terms of your decisions around like actually building the form as a substance, the film as a form, as a substance. So yeah, I was thinking about editing and cutting and forming.
I did think a lot about heads and framing, because what he was talking about was heads a lot, and how when I started looking at Jonathan through the camera, I'm looking at his head, which is going through incredible substance changes, right? Because it's lots of hair, and then it's no hair, and then there's contusions on his skin, and it's a very, it's like clay. I mean, our skin is like clay, and I see him change. So I was thinking about him in context of his life, and him in context of the art world, of what I knew, what he had told me about his influences, and about his own art. And it's imperfect. Maybe it's the film's a little too socially conversational or something, but it's hard. It's really,
I think there's an essential story about the film is that Coleen, when you made it, you were pregnant, yeah?
oh yeah.
Yeah.
I was 8 months pregnant.
And here's Jonathan dying, you're pregnant.
Yeah.
There's this
And he's
perfect
smoking,
kind of symmetry.
smoking constantly, right?
Yeah.
I'm trying to get as far away,
He's
the
got all
camera
his hair
back.
falling out and he's smoking cigarettes, But then there was, because this gap of raising a child, then it was 20 years
Yeah,
before
it was
you
a long
edited,
time,
So
yeah.
it's an interesting, kind of like all the material was there, and then the edit,
Yeah.
had this distance
My
to
kid
it.
was born a week before Jonathan died, or the reverse. I can never remember which way it was, but it was almost like the same timing.
I wonder, because I did these interviews with Jonathan too, when I knew he was seriously ill, and I just wanted to make sure his voice was preserved. So I did 9 interviews with him. We were about the same time as you doing the film, and then I had them transcribed. This was '92, and I didn't listen to them until Marion asked me to write the essay for this catalog, and I've wondered about that, just like I've wondered about, in a sense, the time, like that the time between when you did the filming and the time you did it. And I just feel on some level, I wonder if it has to do with him. I feel almost like missing him. Like there was a way in which it was almost kind of unbearable to listen to it. And then going back after all this time, I knew it would be a kind of treasure to hear his voice again, and the candor and the thoughts, because it's so honest. And then I feel it's amazing, but I feel I can do that now. And I just wondered, like even with what you're saying, what maybe 20 years was somehow the right amount of time that, in order to go back to it the way you needed to go back to it.
Right, it's hard to say. I knew Barbara during that whole period, and you, and Barbara was getting older, and I just thought, well, I better finish it before she dies, because she was very invested in emotionally in it. I made the film myself without help from Barbara, but she wanted a film. She wanted him to be remembered, and actually I wanted to film you again, Michael. But you were always like, well, no, not yet. So I only have Michael during that period, and I thought it would have been nicer to get sort of a commentary about the change, but it is very hard, especially you were so close to him. It's got to be
I think
painful.
part of it was the difficulty in going. I could do it
Right.
now, but
Right.
it was the difficulty in going back.
Yeah.
It was very interesting to hear all your comments, because I was at General Studies with Jonathan, and we were studying art history together. And it was a very strange time, because outside in the world, it was the end of abstract expressionism, and pop art and minimal art were coming out. And yet all the European scholars were there teaching the iconography of the Renaissance. And so we had this strange dichotomy of what was happening there, and yet this
Who was
whole
there?
world...
Wittkower, Brendel, people like that?
Brendel, Wittkower, de
Julius
Tolnay,
Held, Ted Rath.
Panofsky gave some talks. I mean, we had this very rich world in front of us. We had minimal somewhere there, pop art, and we were all very confused, because I also was interested in becoming a painter, and he was... So there was this strange dichotomy of what do we do now? We have all this amazing information coming in from Europe, and yet we have a whole other development happening. And since the abstract expressionists was already a little bit in decline, there was a lot of confusion about, look at all this interesting material in iconography. Look at all the stories and narratives and things of history. So hearing you talk, it comes back to me. We also had a mutual friend called Avram Kampf, who was also from Europe. I don't know if you knew him at all. From
He was
Vienna.
Israeli, wasn't he?
Yes, he was from Vienna originally. So it's fascinating to see that this tension between tremendous iconography and information of history with something that was eliminating more and more of that kind of history was happening simultaneously. And so it really fascinates me to hear all of this now, in retrospect, from that very long time ago. Yeah.
Great, thank you. John?
Thanks. I was wondering if he ever mentioned Medardo Rosso, and by that I don't mean the sort of wax-covered things that we all think about, but that I was really moved to see that Rosso really kind of, maybe the word is gave himself permission, but he really incorporated the process of making things into the end result in a way that was completely, there was no trickery involved. He just owned it. It just worked. And that the use of molds and things like that in Jonathan's work is, I think, maybe possibly the only other artist I know of that's kind of done that so in such a pure way without any kind of artifice.
I mean, the question that makes me ask is, like, what kind of lineage he had within modern sculpture, and certainly his work is unimaginable without Rodin. The kind of liberties that he took in the process. Rosso's part of it. He talked about Duchampion, and I think there the plasters, the clay, the particular use of surface and volume was important. And then with Rosso, there's that heightened sensitivity to light, and light is absolutely crucial both in the drawings and the sculpture. So I think he was a factor, even if he didn't bring him up. He's part of what made the work possible.
I'd like to bring up the word courage, because I feel like I love hearing all these process concepts, and of course he was very historically interested, but I feel like all the work that he did on himself in a way, all his life, with all the Freudian analyst things that they were working with him on, and what he was going through personally, he finally found a lot of courage, I think, in his later works, where he was able to really say exactly how he felt and have it be very honest. And he knew that he was being courageous in a way. I know that he knew that. And I think, don't you think that that's an important part of him?
I wonder, Karen, do you feel then that there's more courage in the later work than there was in the heads, like the work at the beginning? Or
Well, I think it's a
what's the
different kind.
difference for you?
Well, the difference for me was an experience I had with him personally, which was when he chastised me once for not really doing something that would be, right on, just kind of like really laying it out. And I felt like that really meant something to him. And I feel like that his work meant something to him all along. And I think it was very courageous of him to do it in each phase. But I think courage was a really big part of his work.
Yeah, I think that he was someone who had a very strong sense of prohibitions, so that whatever the decisions he made always had consequence. It wasn't like he could sort of do it. So if there was a big change there, then making that decision to do it and following through with it had a kind of energy of risk taking. I agree with you. Whereas, yeah.
But I think it ended up more a heroic tragedy, like, I mean, there were heroes, but they were torn apart in the end, I think in his mind he was heroic or brave, but ultimately fated, right, to death and failure or something. There was some combination.
Do you feel that there's tragedy in those late drawings, or not?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
In the late drawings, yeah. I don't know how to read that. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know.
Because I think that there's a tone and attitude he wanted in those drawings that is
Maybe
not
that opened up
not
and-
tragic at all.
Yeah, maybe that opened up and blossomed. I was thinking of the plaster works and the more. I thought Kienholz was really a good connection, and that work that was so torn up.
Anybody else? Thank you very much.